June 6, 1944, 8:32 a.m. Normandy, France. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commander of Schwere SS Panzerabteilung Wonderwand, surveyed the bocage country through the periscope of his Tiger I heavy tank. The 33-year-old veteran of the Eastern Front, with 119 confirmed tank kills to his name, represented the pinnacle of German armoured warfare. His Tiger, a 56-ton monster mounting the fearsome 80 T-36 36 L56 gun, had never been defeated in direct combat. That morning near Villers-Bocage, Wittmann was about to encounter something that would shatter his confidence and introduce German tank commanders to a weapon they had not anticipated. A British Sherman tank, supposedly inferior, mounting a gun that could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour at combat ranges. The Sherman Firefly had arrived in Normandy, and German tankers were about to learn that the rules of armoured combat had changed. The story of the Sherman Firefly begins not with American ingenuity, but with British desperation. By late 1942, British tank forces in North Africa had encountered Germany's newest tanks, the Tiger I and the Panther, and discovered their existing weapons were catastrophically inadequate. The standard British tank gun, the 2-pounder, later upgraded to the 6-pounder and then the 75 mm, could not penetrate the frontal armour of these German heavyweights at any practical combat range. British tankers were dying in droves, forced to manoeuvre desperately for side shots, while German gunners picked them off at leisure. The Tiger I, entering service in late 1942, mounted 100 mm of frontal armour on the hull and 100 mm slamlets on the turret front. The Panther, arriving in mid-1943, featured 80 mm of frontal armour sloped at 55 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to 140 mm of vertical armour. These monsters could engage British and American tanks at 2,000 yards while remaining effectively invulnerable to return fire at any range. Britain did possess a weapon capable of defeating German armour. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun, officially designated Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-pounder, had been designed specifically to counter heavy armour. Entering service in early 1943, this 76.2 mm weapon fired a 17-pound armour-piercing projectile at 2,900 feet per second, generating enough kinetic energy to penetrate 140 mm vertical armour at 1,000 yards. The 17-pounder could kill a Tiger from the front and a Panther from any angle at combat ranges. The problem was getting the gun where it was needed. Towed anti-tank guns were vulnerable to artillery, infantry assault, and being overrun by rapidly advancing armour. What British forces desperately needed was the 17-pounder mounted in a tank, providing mobility, protection, and the ability to engage enemy armour on equal terms. The obvious solution was to mount the 17-pounder in a British tank. The problem was that no British tank design could accommodate it. The Cromwell, Britain's main cruiser tank, had a turret ring too small. The Churchill infantry tank faced the same limitation. The Challenger tank, specifically designed around the 17-pounder, wouldn't enter production until 1944 and would be produced in limited numbers. Britain needed a solution immediately, and they needed it in quantity. Major George Brighty of the Royal Artillery had an audacious idea. The Americans were producing Sherman tanks by the thousands under Lend-Lease. Shermans were arriving in Britain faster than crews could be trained to operate them. The Sherman's turret ring, at 69 inches in diameter, was larger than any British tank. Perhaps, Brighty theorised, the 17-pounder could be shoehorned into a Sherman. In August 1943, a team of engineers at the Department of Tank Design in Woolwich Arsenal began what seemed an impossible task. The 17-pounder gun was massive, nearly 10 feet long with a substantial recoil mechanism. The Sherman's turret, designed for the compact American 75mm gun, seemed impossibly small for such a weapon. But Britain had no choice. The invasion of Europe was coming, and British tankers needed a weapon that could fight German heavy armour on equal terms. The engineering challenges were immense. The 17-pounder's recoil was tremendous, generating over 10 tons of force. The Sherman's turret would need reinforcement to handle these stresses. The gun was so long that it extended far beyond the Sherman's hull, making the tank nose-heavy and affecting balance. The recoil mechanism had to be rotated 90 degrees and mounted on the gun's side rather than below it to fit within the turret's confined space. the ammunition presented another problem. The 17-pounder shells were nearly 3 feet long, massive compared to the American 75mm rounds. The Sherman's turret could barely accommodate them. Standard ammunition stowage had to be completely redesigned. The final design managed to fit only 77 rounds, compared to 97 rounds for the standard Sherman 75mm gun. Even the gun's immense length created tactical problems. The barrel protruded so far forward that drivers had to be extremely careful when traversing the turret. More than one Firefly knocked itself out by swinging the gun into trees, buildings, or even other tanks. To partially disguise the distinctive long barrel from German observers, crews were instructed to paint the barrel's tip with camouflage to make it appear shorter from a distance. The crew layout was brutally cramped. The Sherman normally carried 5 crew members: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver machine gunner. The Firefly's massive gun breech intruded so far into the turret that the assistant driver position had to be eliminated, reducing crew to 4. The loader's position became a nightmare of confined space, having to maneuver the heavy, awkward 17-pounder rounds in a space barely large enough to turn around. The radio, normally in the hull, was moved to the turret rear, mounted in an armoured box that protruded from the back of the turret like a lumpy growth. This box, officially called the No. 19 wireless set container, became the Firefly's most distinctive recognition feature. German tankers learned to identify Fireflies instantly by this telltale bulge and prioritized them as targets. Despite all the compromises, the prototype worked. In November 1943, the first Sherman Firefly, officially designated Sherman VC by the British, completed firing trials. The results exceeded expectations. The 17-pounder could penetrate the Tiger I's frontal armour at 1,000 yards, the Panther's frontal armour at 500 yards, and could kill either tank from any angle at 2,000 yards. For the first time since encountering German heavy armour, British forces would have a tank-mounted weapon capable of fighting on equal terms. Production was authorised immediately, with a target of converting 2,100 Shermans to Firefly configuration before the invasion of Europe. The conversion process was complex and time-consuming. Each Sherman had to be completely disassembled, the turret removed and sent to specialised workshops where skilled technicians would spend approximately 200 man-hours installing the 17-pounder and its associated equipment. The hull required modifications to accommodate the changed weight distribution. New ammunition racks had to be welded in place. The radio equipment had to be relocated and the wiring harness completely redone. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, British workshops had converted approximately 342 Shermans to Firefly configuration, far short of the ambitious target, but enough to equip British armoured units with approximately 1 Firefly per troop of 4 tanks. This ratio, 1 heavy-hitting tank supported by 3 standard Shermans, would become the standard British practice throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. The first Fireflies landed in Normandy on D-Day itself, going ashore with the British 3rd Infantry Division. German intelligence had no knowledge of the weapon's existence. In the months leading up to the invasion, British security had been extraordinary. Fireflies were kept away from frontline positions in Italy where they might be observed. Training exercises were conducted away from German reconnaissance aircraft flight paths. Even the name Firefly was never used in radio transmissions, referred to only as Sherman Mark 5C in official communications. The Germans were aware of the 17-pounder anti-tank gun from North Africa and Italy, but they had no intelligence suggesting it had been mounted in a tank. This intelligence failure would prove costly. The Firefly's combat debut came in the opening hours of the invasion. Trooper Joe Eakins, gunner in a Firefly of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, engaged German armour near Sword Beach on the afternoon of June 6th. The target was a Panzer IV, the standard German medium tank mounting a 75mm gun. Eakins fired from approximately 800 yards. The 17-pounder's armour-piercing shot struck the Panzer IV's turret, penetrating completely and detonating the ammunition inside. The German tank exploded in a fireball so violent that the turret was blown 15 feet into the air. Eakins later recalled, "We'd been told the gun was powerful, but seeing it in action was something else entirely. The Jerry tank just came apart. The lads in the other Shermans were stunned. We'd never had that kind of killing power before." The effect on German tankers who encountered the Firefly was profound. Lieutenant Heinrich von Rosen, a Panther commander in the Panzer Lehr division, survived an encounter on June 10th that left him shaken. His account, recorded in a post-war interview, provides insight into German perceptions. "We had engaged a group of Shermans near Tilly-sur-Seulles, standard engagement. We expected to destroy them at range as we had done so many times before. My gunner fired at the lead tank, a clean hit that should have been fatal. The shell ricocheted off the front glacis. Impossible. Sherman armour was thin. Before we could fire again, that same Sherman fired back. The shot struck our mantlet with tremendous force. Our armour held, but barely. The impact was far more violent than anything we had experienced from Sherman's 75mm guns. We withdrew immediately. Later, examining our tank, we found the strike had nearly penetrated. Another few millimeters, and we would have been finished. That was no 75mm gun." German tank commanders began reporting encounters with a new weapon, a Sherman variant mounting what they initially believed to be a high-velocity 75mm or possibly a 76mm gun. German intelligence officers, interrogating captured British tankers, learned the truth. The British had mounted their heavy 17-pounder anti-tank gun in a Sherman hull. The implications were immediately understood and deeply troubling. The Tiger I's primary advantage had been its ability to engage Allied armour at ranges where return fire was ineffective. That advantage had evaporated. The Panther's superiority rested on its combination of sloped armour, powerful gun, and excellent mobility. Now at least some Allied tanks could fight back with equal lethality. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding officer of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 21st Panzer Division, described the psychological impact. "The Tiger and Panther had given our men tremendous confidence. They knew that in a tank duel they held the advantage. The arrival of this new Sherman variant changed the mathematics of combat. Now every engagement carried real risk." Our tank commanders could no longer simply rely on superior armour and firepower. They had to assume that any Sherman might be one of these dangerous variants, and they had to engage accordingly. The psychological effect was significant. Doubt had entered the minds of previously confident crews. The Firefly's effectiveness was demonstrated dramatically on June 13, 1944, during the Battle of Villers-Bocage. This engagement would become one of the most famous tank battles of the war and showcase both the Firefly's capabilities and its limitations. Michael Wittmann, the Tiger ace mentioned at the beginning, led a small force of Tigers and Panzerforce into the town, encountering elements of the British 7th Armoured Division. In a stunning display of tactical aggression, Wittmann's Tiger destroyed approximately 14 Allied tanks and 15 other vehicles in a few minutes of fighting, effectively stopping the British advance. But later that afternoon, as Wittmann attempted to press his advantage, he encountered Fireflies of the 4th County of London Yeomanry. Accounts of exactly what happened vary, but the most credible evidence suggests that Wittmann's Tiger was struck by a Firefly's 17-pounder shot that penetrated the thinner side armour, causing catastrophic internal damage. Wittmann survived this engagement, but his Tiger was knocked out, demonstrating that even the most skilled commander in the best tank Germany produced was vulnerable to the Firefly's gun. The invincible aura surrounding the Tiger had been shattered. The most extraordinary feat of Firefly gunnery occurred on August 8, 1944. During Operation Totalize, the Allied attempt to break through German lines south of Caen. Trooper Joe Ekins, the same gunner who had scored a kill on D-Day, was serving as gunner in a Firefly commanded by Sergeant Gordon. Their troop was positioned in overwatch near the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Craménil when they spotted German armour moving in the distance. The range was extreme, approximately 200 yards, and the targets were partially hull down, showing only their turrets above the ridgeline. Ekins could see through his gun sight that these were not ordinary panzers. The size and shape identified them as Tigers. What Ekins didn't know was that one of these Tigers was commanded by Michael Wittmann himself. The German ace, now commanding officer of the 2nd Company, Schwerer SS Panzerabteilung 101, was leading 5 Tigers in a counterattack against Canadian forces. Wittmann was at the peak of his career, credited with 138 tank kills and regarded as Germany's greatest tank commander. His tactical acumen had been proven in countless engagements on both eastern and western fronts. But on this August afternoon, none of his experience could save him from what was about to happen. Sergeant Gordon ordered Ekins to engage. The gunner laid his sight on the rightmost Tiger, adjusting for range and the slight crosswind. He fired. The 17-pounder's report was deafening inside the confined turret, the recoil rocking the 30-ton Sherman back on its suspension. Through the sight, Ekins watched the tracer arc across the distance. The shot struck the Tiger's turret, penetrating and detonating something inside. The German tank brewed up instantly, smoke and flame erupting from every opening. Without waiting for orders, Ekins traversed to the next target and fired again. Another hit, another Tiger exploding. In less than 12 minutes, Ekins and his crew knocked out 3 Tigers, including Whitman's command tank. Michael Whitman, the ace of aces, was killed instantly when Ekins' shot penetrated his Tiger's turret and detonated the ammunition stored inside. The engagement demonstrated several crucial facts about the Firefly. First, in the hands of a skilled gunner, the 17-pounder was lethally accurate at extreme ranges. Second, the armor-piercing ammunition possessed enough kinetic energy to defeat the heaviest German armor even at these distances. Third, the Sherman's stabilization system, though not designed for the 17-pounder, still provided enough stability for accurate shooting. And finally, the Firefly allowed British tankers to engage German heavy armour on equal or superior terms, negating the tactical advantages that had made the Tiger and Panther so dominant. German responses to the Firefly evolved rapidly. By mid-June 1944, Wehrmacht tank commanders had been briefed to identify and prioritise Firefly tanks in any engagement. The distinctive long barrel and the radio box bulge on the turret rear made identification relatively easy, at least at close ranges. German tactical doctrine was modified to emphasise engaging Fireflies first, even at the cost of allowing standard Shermans to close. This made sense from a tactical standpoint. A single Firefly represented more threat to German armour than an entire troop of standard Shermans. Destroying the Firefly early in an engagement restored German armour's tactical advantage. British crews were aware of being prioritised targets and adapted accordingly. Firefly crews took to camouflaging their distinctive long barrels, painting the forward section to resemble a shorter gun. Some crews went further, mounting false muzzle brakes to disguise the weapon's true length. Tactical positioning also changed. Instead of leading advances where the Firefly would be the first tank spotted, Firefly commanders began positioning their tanks in overwatch or slightly behind the leading elements, allowing standard Shermans to draw fire while the Firefly remained concealed until the critical moment. Sergeant George Dring of the Staffordshire Yeomanry described the psychological reality of commanding a Firefly. "You knew Jerry wanted you dead first. Every German gunner was looking for that long barrel. We learned to stay back, use cover, and wait for the right shot. The other lads in their 75-bin Shermans, they'd push forward, draw fire, and when Jerry revealed himself by shooting at them, we'd nail him. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't exactly fair to the lads in the 75s, but it worked. The Firefly was too valuable to throw away in a quick exchange." The ammunition types available to Firefly crews evolved as the war progressed. Initially, crews were issued primarily armour-piercing capped ballistic capped shot, known as APCBC. This was a solid steel projectile with a windscreen for improved ballistic performance and a soft cap designed to prevent shattering on impact with face-hardened armour. The APCBC round could penetrate 140 mm of armour at 1,000 yards, sufficient to defeat any German tank from the front at combat ranges. Later, an improved armour-piercing round, designated APDS for armour-piercing discarding sabot, became available in limited quantities. This revolutionary ammunition used a tungsten carbide penetrator in a lightweight sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. The result was a projectile travelling at over 4,000 feet per second, with extraordinary penetrating power. APDS could punch through 208 meters of armour at 1,000 yards, making it capable of defeating even the frontal armour of the King Tiger heavy tank. The APDS round came with significant drawbacks. The high velocity and lightweight projectile made it extremely sensitive to crosswinds, reducing accuracy beyond 500 yards. The discarding sabot was unpredictable, sometimes striking the gun barrel as it separated, causing accuracy problems. Most significantly, APDS ammunition was in chronically short supply throughout the war. Tungsten was a strategic material needed for machine tools and other applications. British production could never meet demand. As a result, APDS was rationed carefully. Most Firefly crews received only a handful of APDS rounds, typically 6 to 12, with instructions to use them only against heavily armoured targets at close range where accuracy was assured. High explosive rounds for the 17-pounder were also available but rarely used. The 17-pounder He shell, while effective against soft targets, was expensive to produce and took up precious stowage space that crews preferred to fill with armour-piercing ammunition. Most Firefly crews loaded primarily AP rounds, accepting reduced capability against infantry and soft targets in exchange for maximum anti-tank effectiveness. In practice, this meant that standard Shermans in the troop handled infantry support and soft target engagement, while the Firefly remained focused on its primary mission, killing enemy armour. The Firefly's performance in the bocage country of Normandy revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities. The dense hedgerows, narrow lanes, and limited visibility made long-range gunnery difficult and forced tanks into close-quarters combat, where the Firefly's size became a liability. The long gun barrel, extending well beyond the hull, made navigation through narrow village streets treacherous. More than one Firefly knocked itself out by swinging the gun into a stone building with enough force to damage the barrel or recoil mechanism. The high profile necessary to accommodate the gun's recoil made concealment difficult in the flat open areas between hedgerows. Despite these challenges, Fireflies proved devastatingly effective in the grinding attritional battles of June and July 1944. German tank forces, constrained by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority to largely defensive operations, found themselves repeatedly ambushed by British armour that could now kill Tigers and Panthers from positions of concealment. The psychological advantage enjoyed by German tankers since 1943 had evaporated. Lieutenant Gustav Schröter, a Panther commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, described the changed environment. In Russia, we had been the hunters. In Normandy, we became the hunted. You could never be certain if that Sherman in the hedgerow was a standard model or one of those Firefly variants. If you guessed wrong and engaged at range, you might take a 17-pounder shot through your frontal armour before you realised your mistake. Many good crews died because they underestimated what appeared to be a standard Sherman. The breakout from Normandy in August 1944 and the subsequent race across France saw the Firefly employed in more fluid, mobile operations for which it was better suited. Operating in open country with good visibility, Firefly crews could engage German armour at extended ranges where the 17-pounder's accuracy and penetration were decisive. The German retreat, conducted under constant Allied air attack and with chronic fuel shortages, prevented the kind of concentrated armour counterattacks that might have exploited the Firefly's weaknesses in close combat. British armoured divisions, each typically equipped with 50 to 60 Fireflies, distributed among their Sherman regiments, possessed unprecedented killing power against German armour. The liberation of France saw numerous sharp engagements, where Fireflies demonstrated their value. On August 13, 1944, near Falaise, Fireflies of the 124th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps engaged elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, attempting to escape the Falaise pocket. The engagement, fought at ranges between 800 and 1,500 yards across open farmland, resulted in the destruction of 7 Panthers and 3 Panzer Fürsts for the loss of 2 standard Shermans. Not a single Firefly was lost in the engagement. German after-action reports noted with frustration that British tank gunnery had improved dramatically, not realising that it was not improved gunnery, but superior weaponry that was killing their tanks. The Firefly's effectiveness led to a curious problem for British forces. As word spread through armoured units about the weapon's capabilities, demand for Firefly tanks far exceeded supply. Tank crews began requesting transfers to Firefly units. Some crews went so far as to modify their standard Shermans cosmetically to resemble Fireflies, hoping to deter German targeting. The practice became widespread enough that British Army Command had to issue orders forbidding such modifications, as they drew German fire to tanks that lacked the Firefly's actual combat capability. This strange situation, where troops were eager to crew a tank that the enemy prioritised for destruction, spoke volumes about the confidence the 17-pounder inspired. By September 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, Firefly production had increased significantly. British workshops in the United Kingdom and France were converting approximately 100 Shermans per month to Firefly configuration. The ratio of Fireflies in British armoured regiments increased from 1 per troop to sometimes 2 per troop, dramatically increasing anti-armour capability. Some specialized units, particularly those expected to face heavy concentrations of German armor, received even higher proportions of Fireflies. The Allied airborne Operation Market Garden in September 1944 saw Fireflies play a crucial role in the ground advance. The narrow corridor from the Belgian border to Arnhem, with armoured units confined to a single road, seemed tailor-made for German ambushes. Elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, though under-strength and under-equipped, still possessed Panthers and other heavy armour that could have devastated the British advance. Fireflies positioned at the front of advancing columns repeatedly engaged and destroyed German armour, attempting to block the road. In one notable engagement near Valkenswaard on September 17th, a single Firefly knocked out 2 Panthers in quick succession, allowing the advance to continue. The autumn and winter of 1944-45 saw Fireflies engaged in some of the most intense armoured combat of the war. The German Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, committed Germany's last significant armoured reserves, including elite SS Panzer divisions equipped with King Tiger heavy tanks. These 70-ton monsters mounted the fearsome 88 mm K43L71 gun and had frontal armour up to 180 metre thick. Standard Allied tank guns, including the American 75 Leon 76mm weapons, were ineffective against the King Tiger's frontal armour at any practical range. The 17-pounder remained one of the few weapons capable of engaging these behemoths successfully. British Fireflies, committed to contain the northern shoulder of the German penetration, proved their worth repeatedly. On December 23rd, near Hotten, Fireflies of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment engaged King Tigers of the 1st SS Panzer Division. The engagement demonstrated both the 17-pounder's capabilities and its limitations. At 1,200 yards, APC-BC ammunition could not reliably penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armour. Firefly crews had to manoeuvre for flank shots or use their small allocation of APDS ammunition for frontal penetrations. In the Hotten engagement, 3 King Tigers were destroyed, 2 by flank shots with APC-BC and 1 by a frontal APDS shot at under 600 yards. Hauptsturmführer Ernst Bachmann, a King Tiger commander who survived multiple encounters with Fireflies during the Ardennes fighting, provided post-war testimony about the experience. The British Sherman with the long gun was the only Allied tank we truly feared. The American 76 mm Sherman and even their new Pershing could be engaged with confidence. But the Firefly demanded respect. Its gun could penetrate our armour if the crew was skilled and lucky. More importantly, the British crews who operated them were experienced and aggressive. They understood their weapon and employed it effectively. We learned to identify them by their distinctive silhouette and engage them first whenever possible. But in the confused close-range fighting in the Ardennes, you often didn't have that luxury. The clearing of the Rhineland in early 1945 saw Fireflies fighting in terrain that emphasized their strengths. The relatively open country allowed long-range gunnery, and German armour, now critically short of fuel and increasingly manned by poorly trained crews, could not employ the aggressive manoeuvring tactics that might have countered the Fireflies' advantages. British armoured units advanced with Fireflies in overwatch positions, engaging any German armour that revealed itself while standard Shermans dealt with infantry and anti-tank guns. An engagement on March 2, 1945, near Gelden exemplified the Fireflies' dominance in this phase of the war. A troop of 3 Fireflies from the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry encountered 6 Panthers of the 116th Panzer Division in relatively open farmland. The engagement range was approximately 1,000 yards. Within 4 minutes, all 6 Panthers had been destroyed without loss to the British tanks. German after-action reports noted that the British gunnery was impossibly accurate, and that penetrations were achieved against frontal armour at ranges previously thought safe. What German analysts didn't fully appreciate was that it wasn't superhuman gunnery, but rather the combination of a powerful gun, excellent optics, and increasingly experienced crews that made such results possible. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 and the final advance into Germany saw Fireflies operating in their ideal environment: open terrain, good visibility, and a demoralized enemy with limited fuel and ammunition. German tank forces, once the terror of Europe, were reduced to static defensive positions, often dug in and used as immobile pillboxes due to fuel shortages. This played perfectly into the Firefly's strengths. British armoured units would locate German armour positions, bring up Fireflies, and systematically destroy them from ranges where German return fire was ineffective. The last significant armoured engagement involving Fireflies occurred in mid-April 1945 near Wellsen. Elements of the 7th Armoured Division encountered dug-in King Tigers and Panthers defending the town. The German tanks, unable to manoeuvre due to fuel shortages, were picked off one by Fireflies firing from hull-down positions at 500 to 2,000 yards. The Germans returned fire, but at these extreme ranges, even the powerful 80 mm und K-43 of the King Tiger struggled for accuracy. By the engagement's end, 8 German heavy tanks had been destroyed for no British losses. It was an anticlimax to years of armoured warfare, but it demonstrated how completely the tactical equation had shifted. The final statistics for Firefly operations remained somewhat uncertain, as British record-keeping during the rapid advances of 1944-45 was often incomplete. Conservative estimates suggest that Fireflies were directly responsible for destroying approximately 500 to 600 German armoured vehicles during the Northwest Europe campaign. This number, while impressive, understates the Firefly's true impact. The weapon's mere presence on the battlefield forced German tactical decisions that degraded their effectiveness. German tank commanders, knowing that any Sherman might be a Firefly, could not engage with the aggressive confidence that had characterized their operations in 1942 and 1943. The psychological impact on German tankers was profound and lasting. Veterans interviewed decades after the war consistently identified the Firefly as the Allied tank they most respected and feared. This was particularly striking given that German tankers also faced Soviet heavy tanks mounting 122mm guns and later American Pershings with 90mm guns. The reason for the Firefly's outsized psychological impact seems to have been timing. It arrived at a moment when German tankers had grown confident in their superiority, and it demonstrated that this superiority was illusory. The shock of discovering that Shermans, previously dismissed as inferior, could now kill Tigers and Panthers from the front at combat ranges, fundamentally altered German tankers' perception of the battlefield. Major Hans von Luck, previously quoted, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment in his post-war memoir. The Firefly changed everything. Before its appearance, we could engage Allied armour with confidence, knowing that our Tigers and Panthers held decisive advantages. After the Firefly appeared in numbers, every encounter became potentially lethal. The mathematics of tank combat had shifted. This single weapon, mounted in what we had considered an inferior tank, forced a fundamental reassessment of our tactical doctrine. The technical achievement represented by the Firefly deserves emphasis. British engineers had taken a gun designed for towed anti-tank use, a weapon never intended for mounting in a turret, and successfully integrated it into a foreign tank design not built to accommodate it. The resulting hybrid was cramped, ungainly, and mechanically complex, requiring skilled crews to operate effectively. Yet, it worked. It worked well enough to deploy in quantity, reliably enough to maintain in field conditions, and lethally enough to kill the best tanks Germany could produce. This was engineering pragmatism at its finest, solving an urgent operational requirement with available resources rather than waiting for an ideal solution that might never arrive. The Firefly's success vindicated British doctrine emphasizing firepower over other considerations. While American tank development had focused on mechanical reliability and ease of production, accepting inferior armament to achieve these goals, British experience in North Africa had taught the painful lesson that inadequate firepower was fatal, regardless of how reliable the vehicle. The Firefly represented British determination to provide their tank crews with weapons that could fight on equal terms with the best enemy equipment. The cost in crew comfort, ammunition stowage, and operational complexity was accepted as necessary. Comparisons between the Firefly and American attempts to upgun the Sherman are instructive. The United States developed the M4A3E8 Sherman, mounting the 76mm M1 gun. This weapon, while superior to the standard 75mm, still could not reliably penetrate Panther or Tiger frontal armour at combat ranges. American tankers repeatedly requested more powerful armament. Some units received the M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun late in the war, but too few and too late to significantly impact the fighting. The British, facing the same problem earlier and lacking American industrial capacity to develop an entirely new tank, chose the pragmatic solution of making the best tank they had access to, the Sherman, into a tank killer through brute force engineering. The question often raised is why the United States didn't adopt the Firefly design. Several factors prevented American adoption. First, American doctrine emphasized numerical superiority and mechanical reliability over individual tank capability. The US Specialstärke Army preferred 5 reliable Sherman 75s to 3 mechanically complex Fireflies. Second, the 17-pounder was a British weapon using different ammunition standards. Adopting it would have complicated American logistics. Third, by the time the Firefly had proven itself in Normandy, American tank development had moved toward the 90mm armed Pershing. Finally, American experience in the Pacific, where Japanese armor was thin and infantry support was the primary tank mission, emphasized different requirements than the European theater. The Firefly's post-war career was brief. With the war's end, the urgent need for its capabilities evaporated. The British Army, facing post-war budget constraints, began retiring its Sherman fleet in favour of new designs. The Firefly, being a hybrid modification rather than a purpose-built tank, was among the first to go. By 1950, most Fireflies had been scrapped or sold to foreign militaries. Some served with the Belgian and Italian armies into the 1950s. Others went to Middle Eastern countries and saw combat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But the Firefly's moment had passed. It was a weapon born of desperate necessity, perfect for its time and purpose, and obsolete once that purpose was fulfilled. Today, only a handful of Fireflies survive in museums and private collections. The Imperial War Museum in London houses a particularly well-preserved example. The Bovington Tank Museum possesses several, including restored runners that are occasionally demonstrated. Each time one of these survivors is started, the distinctive rumble of the American engine contrasts oddly with the very British long-barreled gun, a reminder of the hybrid nature that was both the Firefly's weakness and its strength. The Sherman Firefly represents a fascinating case study in weapons development. It was never supposed to exist. British tank doctrine called for purpose-built designs, not hybrid conversions. American Shermans were supposed to be infantry support tanks, not tank killers. The 17-pounder was supposed to be a towed anti-tank gun, not a tank weapon. Yet, from these mismatched components, British engineers created one of the most effective tank killers of World War II. It succeeded not through elegant design, but through pragmatic problem-solving and acceptance of necessary compromises. The crews who operated Fireflies deserve recognition for mastering a difficult, cramped and dangerous machine. They knew they were priority targets. They knew their tanks were mechanically temperamental. They knew the cramped turret made their job physically exhausting. Yet they also knew that when they pressed the firing pedal and sent a 17-pounder shot down range, they had a weapon that could kill any German tank at combat ranges. That confidence, the ability to fight on equal terms rather than as victims, made every compromise worth accepting. German tankers who faced the Firefly learned a lesson that militaries throughout history have had to relearn. Technical superiority is temporary and fragile. In 1943, German armour had seemed invincible. Tigers and Panthers dominated every battlefield they appeared on. German tankers had every reason to feel confident. Then, in a matter of months, that superiority evaporated, not because German tanks became worse, but because Allied tanks became better. The Firefly, ugly, cramped, and mechanically awkward, proved that innovation born of necessity can overcome what appears to be overwhelming technical advantage. The laughter of German tank commanders watching ungainly Shermans struggle against Tigers in 1943 had died by 1944. In its place was grudging respect and genuine fear of the one Sherman variant that could kill them from the front. The Firefly's 17-pounder had spoken, and German armour had learned to listen. When the war ended in May 1945, the Sherman Firefly had been in frontline service for less than a year, yet in that brief period, it had fundamentally altered the armoured warfare landscape in northwest Europe. Its legacy remains a testament to what can be achieved when desperate need meets pragmatic engineering and courageous crews willing to take a hybrid machine into battle against the world's most feared tanks. The technical evolution of the Firefly continued even as the war progressed. British ordnance engineers, never satisfied with initial solutions, continually refined the weapon system. In late 1944, improved armor-piercing ammunition designated Mark 8 became available, featuring an improved ballistic cap design that reduced drag and improved accuracy at extended ranges. This ammunition could maintain lethal penetration against Tiger armor out to 800 yards, extending the Firefly's effective engagement envelope significantly. Crews who received the new ammunition reported noticeable improvements in accuracy, particularly at ranges beyond 1,000 yards where wind, drift and projectile drop had previously complicated fire solutions. The logistics of supporting Firefly operations presented unique challenges that often go unmentioned in combat accounts. Each Firefly required different ammunition from standard Shermans, complicating supply arrangements. Ordnance units had to maintain separate stocks of 17-pounder ammunition, ensure proper distribution to Firefly-equipped units, and track consumption rates that differed significantly from standard Sherman units. The physical size and weight of 17-pounder rounds, nearly twice that of 75-litre ammunition, meant fewer rounds could be transported per supply vehicle. In practice, this meant that Firefly units required proportionally more ammunition supply trucks than standard Sherman units, a factor that British logistics officers had to accommodate in their planning. Maintenance presented another layer of complexity. The 17-pounder's recoil system, rotated 90 degrees to fit within the Sherman turret, was prone to oil leaks and required more frequent servicing than the standard Sherman's 75mm gun. The hydraulic traverse system, stressed by the heavier gun's weight and recoil forces, wore out faster and required more frequent adjustment. British armoured units learned to maintain small, specialised teams of fitters specifically trained on Firefly systems, as standard Sherman mechanics often lacked the knowledge to properly service the hybrid design. These specialists became invaluable, often working through the night to ensure that Fireflies remained operational for the next day's combat. The social dynamics within British armoured troops that included Fireflies were complex and fascinating. Firefly crews occupied a peculiar position, simultaneously privileged and endangered. They had the most powerful weapon in the troop, providing them with a certain status and respect from other crews. However, they were also the primary target in any engagement, meaning their life expectancy was arguably lower than crews in standard Shermans. This created a strange camaraderie where Firefly crews were simultaneously envied and pitied by their fellow tankers. Trooper Bill Bellamy of the 8th Hussars described the dynamic in his post-war memoir. "We all wanted to be in a Firefly because it meant you had a fighting chance against Jerry heavy armour, but we also knew that if we got into a scrap, every German gun would be looking for us first. The lads in the 75mm Shermans, they'd joke that they were glad to let us have the honour of the big gun. But when things got hot, they'd position themselves to draw fire away from us because they knew if we got knocked out early, the whole troop was in trouble. It was an unspoken understanding. They protected us so we could protect them." This tactical interdependence shaped how British armoured troops fought. Standard Shermans would often advance in pairs, presenting multiple targets and forcing German gunners to divide their attention. Meanwhile, the Firefly would remain slightly back, in a position to observe and engage any German armour that revealed itself. When contact occurred, standard Shermans would manoeuvre aggressively, not necessarily to close with the enemy, but to complicate his targeting solution and force him to engage while the Firefly lined up the killing shot. It was combined arms tactics applied at the troop level, each element supporting the others in their specialised roles. The winter of 1944-45 brought new challenges for Firefly operations. The cold weather of the European winter affected the hydraulic systems particularly badly. Hydraulic fluid would thicken in freezing temperatures, making turret traverse sluggish and gun elevation difficult. Crews learned to keep the turret constantly rotating slightly during cold nights, to keep the hydraulics from freezing completely. Some resourceful crews rigged improvised heating systems, running hot exhaust gases past the hydraulic reservoir to maintain fluid temperature. These field modifications, never officially sanctioned but widely practiced, represented the kind of practical problem-solving that kept Fireflies operational under brutal conditions. The snow and mud of winter also emphasised the Sherman chassis' limitations. The Firefly, already nose-heavy due to the long gun, became even more unbalanced when the forward sections accumulated snow and ice. Drivers had to be extremely cautious, as the shifted weight distribution made the tank more prone to bogging down in soft ground. More than one Firefly had to be towed out of mud by recovery vehicles after the weight of the gun caused the front end to sink while attempting to cross boggy terrain. British armoured units learned to route Fireflies on the firmest ground available, even if this meant taking slightly longer routes to objectives. The final months of the war saw some of the most significant Firefly engagements, even as German resistance was collapsing. On April 15, 1945, near Bremen, Sergeant Jack Wardrop of the Nottinghamshire Yeomanry encountered what would be recorded as possibly the last King Tiger lost in combat with British forces. The German tank, dug in and camouflaged in a bombed-out factory district, had destroyed 2 standard Shermans before Wardrop's Firefly could locate it. The engagement occurred at under 400 yards, point-blank range for tank combat. Wardrop's gunner fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The first struck the King Tiger's mantlet and ricocheted, a testimony to the German tank's formidable armour. The second shot, aimed lower, struck the glacis plate just below the turret ring and penetrated, though it failed to knock out the tank. The third shot, fired as the King Tiger's gun was traversing toward Wardrop's position, struck the turret side at the junction with the hull and penetrated cleanly, detonating the German tank's ammunition. The resulting explosion was so violent that it collapsed part of the factory building. Wardrop's crew survived, though the engagement left them shaken. His after-action report noted simply, "Even at the end, Jerry armour was dangerous. The Firefly's gun saved our lives." By late April 1945, German tank forces had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Individual tanks or small groups still fought on, often stationary due to lack of fuel, but organised armoured operations were no longer possible. Firefly crews found their primary mission shifting from anti-tank combat to infantry support and fortification reduction. The 17-pounder, designed specifically to kill heavy armour, proved surprisingly effective against fortified positions. High explosive shells, though rarely used earlier in the war, became standard ammunition. The massive gun's ability to deliver a 17-pound explosive shell with flat trajectory and high velocity made it excellent for precision demolition work. Concrete bunkers, reinforced buildings, and field fortifications that might have required artillery or air support could be engaged directly by Fireflies operating in direct fire mode. Captain David Render of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment described this final phase of Firefly operations. "By the last weeks we rarely saw German armour. When we did, it was usually abandoned or out of fuel. Our job became supporting the infantry as they cleared towns and villages. The 17-pounder, ridiculous as it sounds, became a building demolition tool. We'd get called up when the infantry encountered a strong point they couldn't reduce with their weapons. We'd put a few HE shells into it from 500 or 600 yards, precision shooting, and the position would collapse. It wasn't what the gun was designed for, but it worked. Strange to think that a weapon built specifically to kill tigers ended the war knocking down buildings. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For Firefly crews, the end came with mixed emotions. Relief at having survived, certainly, but also a strange sense of anticlimax. They had trained for and executed one of the most specialised missions in armoured warfare, hunting and killing the most dangerous tanks ever built. Now, that mission was complete. The Tigers and Panthers they had feared and fought were burning wrecks scattered across Europe, or sitting in British and American testing grounds. The Firefly's moment of supreme relevance had passed. The immediate post-war period saw British military planners assessing lessons learned from the Firefly experience. The official reports, now declassified, reveal interesting insights into British military thinking. On the positive side, the Firefly had proven that existing vehicles could be successfully upgunned to meet new threats, that hybrid solutions could be viable under combat conditions, and that firepower remained the decisive factor in tank combat. On the negative side, the reports noted that such conversions were maintenance-intensive, that they created logistical complications, and that purpose-built designs were preferable when time and resources permitted. The conclusion was essentially that the Firefly had been the right solution for the circumstances, but that future British tank development should emphasise purpose-built designs from the start. The Americans, observing British Firefly operations, drew their own conclusions. Post-war debriefs of American tankers who had fought alongside British units revealed significant interest in the Firefly concept. Many American tankers expressed frustration that the United States had not adopted a similar solution earlier. Captain Belton Cooper, an American ordnance officer who worked extensively with armoured units, wrote in his memoir that American tankers facing German heavy armour with inadequate weapons felt betrayed by their own military's failure to provide effective armament. He argued that had the United States adopted the 17-pounder or developed a comparable weapon earlier, American tank losses in northwest Europe would have been significantly lower. This debate continued for decades after the war, with historians and veterans arguing about whether American tank doctrine's emphasis on numerical superiority over individual capability had been vindicated or revealed as tragically flawed. Soviet observers also took note of the Firefly. The Red Army, which had been developing its own heavy-hitting tank destroyers like the Su-100 and ISU-152, recognized the value of mounting powerful guns on reliable chassis. While Soviet doctrine differed significantly from British approaches, the basic principle of ensuring that frontline units had weapons capable of defeating enemy heavy armor was universal. Soviet post-war tank development emphasized large guns and heavy armor, lessons learned from their own brutal experiences on the Eastern Front, but reinforced by observing Western Allied solutions like the Firefly. The Firefly's influence extended beyond its immediate military impact. In the decades following World War II, the principle of upgunning existing platforms to meet new threats became standard practice in armoured forces worldwide. The Israeli Defense Forces would become particularly adept at this, repeatedly upgrading Sherman tanks with more powerful guns and selling the upgraded vehicles to other nations. The American M60 tank would go through multiple upgunning programs, as would virtually every other successful tank design. The Firefly had demonstrated that this approach, while not ideal, was viable and could be implemented relatively quickly when urgent operational need demanded it. The technical data accumulated from Firefly operations proved invaluable for post-war weapons development. British ordnance engineers had effectively conducted a years-long combat test of a high-velocity tank gun under every conceivable operational condition. The data on barrel wear, recoil system performance, ammunition effectiveness, and crew ergonomics fed directly into post-war tank gun development. The Centurion tank, which would become Britain's primary post-war tank design, incorporated lessons learned from the Firefly program. While it mounted a different gun, the 20-pounder, the overall design philosophy showed clear influence from Firefly experience, emphasizing firepower and protection over mobility. The human cost of Firefly operations, while difficult to quantify precisely, was significant. Being the priority target in any engagement meant that Firefly crews faced higher casualty rates than other Sherman variants. British records, incomplete due to wartime record-keeping challenges, suggest that Firefly crews had approximately 20 to 30% higher casualty rates than crews of standard Shermans in the same units. This statistic, while grimly significant, must be understood in context. Firefly crews were typically the most experienced and skilled in their troops. They were deliberately placed in positions where they would encounter enemy armor. And when they did encounter it, they were fighting the most dangerous German tanks at the most critical moments of engagements. That they suffered higher casualties is unsurprising. What is perhaps more remarkable is that the differential wasn't even higher, a testament to the protective value of the Sherman's armour and the tactical skill of British tankers. The stories of individual Firefly crews provide the human context behind the statistics. Sergeant Gordon and Trooper Eakins, the crew that killed Michael Whitman, survived the war. Eakins never fully accepted credit for Whitman's death, insisting it was a team effort and that any gunner with a Firefly could have achieved the same result with luck. Gordon, in post-war interviews, emphasized the psychological burden of commanding a Firefly. You knew that every German gunner wanted you dead first. You knew that if you made a mistake, got careless, took unnecessary risk, you weren't just endangering yourself but your entire crew, and possibly your whole troop. That weight never left you. Even decades later, I still dream about it sometimes. The responsibility of having that gun. Other crews were less fortunate. The casualty lists from British armoured units in northwest Europe include hundreds of Firefly crewmen killed in action. Each death represented not just a lost life, but lost expertise, as Firefly crews were selected from the most skilled and experienced men available. The loss of a Firefly crew meant not just replacing 5 men, but replacing 5 trained specialists who understood the complex weapon system and had learned through hard experience how to employ it effectively. British armoured units devoted significant effort to rapidly training replacement Firefly crews, but there was no substitute for combat experience. Replacement crews, no matter how well trained, lack the instinctive understanding of how to fight with the Firefly that could only come from surviving multiple engagements. The mechanical reliability of the Firefly, or lack thereof, deserves examination. The Sherman chassis was generally reliable, one of its primary virtues. However, the modifications necessary to mount the 17-pounder introduced new failure points. The modified recoil system was complex and temperamental. The hydraulic traverse system, stressed by the heavier gun, required constant maintenance. The ammunition stowage, modified to accommodate the longer 17-pounder rounds, was prone to jamming if rounds were not carefully positioned. British maintenance records show that Fireflies required approximately 40% more maintenance man-hours than standard Shermans, a significant burden on already stretched field maintenance units. That Fireflies maintained operational readiness rates comparable to standard Shermans speaks to the dedication of British mechanics working under field conditions to keep these complex hybrids running. The sound of the Firefly became legendary among those who experienced it. The 17-pounder's report was distinctly different from the Sherman's 75 mm gun, louder and sharper with a distinctive crack rather than a boom. Veterans on both sides of the conflict described being able to identify a Firefly firing by sound alone. German infantry learned to take cover immediately upon hearing that distinctive crack, knowing that it meant British tanks were engaging armour and that the battlefield was about to become extremely dangerous. The psychological effect of that sound should not be underestimated. It represented to German forces the presence of a weapon that could kill their best tanks, and to Allied forces the presence of their best tank killer. Sound, in the chaos and confusion of armoured combat, became an important tactical indicator. The training evolution for Firefly crews reflected lessons learned in combat. Early Firefly crews, trained hastily before D-Day, received minimal specialised instruction. They learned the mechanical differences from standard Shermans, but had little time to develop specialised tactics. As the campaign progressed and experience accumulated, British armoured training establishments developed more comprehensive Firefly-specific training programs. By late 1944, Firefly crews received specialised gunnery training, emphasising long-range shooting, rapid target acquisition, and the unique ballistics of the 17-pounder. Commanders received tactical training on employing Fireflies within troop formations. Loaders received specific training on handling the awkward 17-pounder ammunition in the cramped turret. This professionalisation of Firefly training, though it came relatively late in the war, significantly improved crew effectiveness and probably reduced casualties by ensuring crews understood their weapon and how to fight with it. The Cold War period saw the Firefly concept fade into obsolescence. Post-war tank development moved toward purpose-built designs with powerful guns, heavy armour and improved mobility. The idea of converting existing tanks by shoehorning in larger guns seemed dated in an era when entirely new tanks could be designed and built relatively quickly. The Sherman chassis itself, while reliable, was fundamentally a World War II design unsuited for the speeds, protection levels and firepower requirements of Cold War armoured warfare. By 1960, virtually all Fireflies had been retired from frontline service, relegated to training roles or sold to minor powers. The last operational Fireflies were probably those serving with minor South American militaries into the 1970s, used more for internal security than any realistic combat role. The Firefly's place in armour history is secure despite its brief service life. It demonstrated several principles that remain relevant. First, that operational necessity can drive innovation in ways that peacetime development cannot. The Firefly existed because British tankers were dying, full stop. That urgent need drove engineers to achieve what seemed impossible. Second, that hybrid solutions, while not ideal, can be effective if properly implemented. The Firefly was never as good as a purpose-built tank destroyer would have been, but it was good enough and available quickly enough to make a critical difference. Third, that firepower remains the decisive factor in armoured combat. British tankers would rather have a cramped, mechanically complex tank with a gun that could kill the enemy than a comfortable, reliable tank that couldn't. Modern armour veterans studying World War II often focus on the Firefly as an example of necessity breeding innovation. The United States Marine Corps, for example, has examined the Firefly program when considering rapid upgunning of existing armoured vehicles to counter new threats. The Israeli upgunning programs for Sherman and Centurion tanks drew direct inspiration from the British Firefly experience. Even modern programs like the integration of 120 Medonde guns onto older tank chassis reflect the same basic principle: use what you have, modify it as necessary, and get effective weapons to the troops who need them as quickly as possible. The mythology surrounding the Firefly has grown over the decades since the war. Some accounts exaggerate its capabilities, portraying it as a superweapon that could destroy any German tank with ease. Others dismiss it as a stopgap measure that barely worked. The reality, as usual, lies between these extremes. The Firefly was a good weapon, not a perfect one. It had significant limitations in crew comfort, mechanical reliability, and tactical flexibility. But it also had the one quality that mattered most: it could kill Tigers and Panthers from the front at combat ranges. For British tankers who had watched their squadrons decimated by German heavy armour, who had seen friends die in tanks that couldn't fight back effectively, the Firefly represented hope. It meant they could fight on equal terms. That psychological factor, perhaps as much as the technical capability, explains the Firefly's enduring reputation. The preservation of surviving Fireflies has become a priority for military museums and private collectors. Each surviving example represents a significant piece of military history and a unique technical achievement. Restoration efforts face challenges due to the hybrid nature of the vehicle. Standard Sherman parts are relatively available, but Firefly-specific components like the modified turret, the 17-pounder gun, and the specialized ammunition are rare. Some museums have invested years and significant resources into authentic restorations, tracking down original components or manufacturing replacements to original specifications. The result is a small number of authentic, operational Fireflies that can be demonstrated for historical education and remembrance. The annual Tank Fest at Bovington Tank Museum includes live fire demonstrations with a restored Firefly, one of the few places in the world where the distinctive crack of a 17-pounder can still be heard. Veterans who attend these demonstrations, now in their 90s or beyond, often become emotional watching and hearing the weapon they fought with 7 decades ago. The sound, the recoil, the entire sensory experience triggers memories of combat, of friends lost, of desperate fights against overwhelming odds. For them, the Firefly is not a museum piece, but a memorial to their service and sacrifice. The Firefly appears frequently in historical simulations, video games, and fictional accounts of World War II. These popular culture representations, while often inaccurate in details, have kept the Firefly's name and basic story alive for generations who did not experience the war. Young people who might never read a military history book know about the Firefly from games like World of Tanks or War Thunder, where its distinctive long gun and powerful shot make it a favourite. While these representations simplify and often sensationalize, they serve the purpose of maintaining cultural memory of the weapon and the men who fought with it. Academic military historians continue to study the Firefly as a case study in weapons procurement and doctrinal adaptation. The speed with which British forces identified a capability gap, developed a solution, and deployed it to combat units remains impressive by any standard. Modern military procurement, often criticised for taking decades to field new weapons, stands in stark contrast to the Firefly program, which went from concept to combat deployment in under a year. Whether this comparison is entirely fair, given the different circumstances of wartime urgency versus peacetime development, is debatable, but the basic question remains relevant. How can military forces rapidly respond to new threats without sacrificing quality or safety? The answer the Firefly program suggests is that rapid fielding requires accepting compromises. The Firefly was cramped, mechanically complex, and maintenance-intensive. These were not oversights but conscious trade-offs made to field an effective weapon quickly. Modern procurement, with its emphasis on perfection and zero defects, might never approve such a design. Yet that imperfect design made a critical difference when it mattered most. The lesson, perhaps, is that adequate solutions delivered quickly may be more valuable than perfect solutions delivered too late, a lesson that remains challenging for modern military bureaucracies to internalize. The Sherman Firefly story ultimately is a human story more than a technical one. Yes, it was an impressive engineering achievement. Yes, it demonstrated innovative thinking and rapid problem-solving. But fundamentally, it was about men in desperate circumstances demanding better tools to do an incredibly dangerous job, and about engineers and mechanics working around the clock to provide those tools. Every Firefly that rolled off the conversion line represented hundreds of hours of skilled labour. Every Firefly that fought in Normandy, Holland, or Germany represented a crew of 5 men who volunteered to crew the tank that every German gunner wanted to kill first. That courage, that determination, that refusal to accept defeat in the face of technical inferiority is what the Firefly truly represents. When Trooper Joe Ekins lined up his sight on Michael Whitman's Tiger that August morning in 1944, he was not thinking about technical specifications or procurement decisions. He was doing his job, the job he had trained for, using the weapon his nation had provided him. That weapon, ugly and ungainly and imperfect as it was good enough. The 17-pounder spoke, and the Tiger died. And for that moment, all the compromises and complications and challenges of the Firefly program were justified. That is the Firefly's legacy. Not perfection, but adequacy when it mattered most. Delivered by courage when it was needed desperately. The Sherman Firefly shocked German tank commanders not because it was the best tank ever built, but because it was good enough to kill them when they thought themselves invincible. And sometimes, good enough is all that victory requires.